We're going to throw a photo up on the screen here. The first photo that Josiah is going to throw on the screen is a photo of our living room. Many of you have seen this place. If you've been to our home for a party or a welcome dinner, whatever, many of you just dropped in and said hello. If you haven't been in our home, we would really like to have you. That's actually a high priority for us, and you can see when our next welcome dinner is on the back of the series card and RSVP for that. We'd love to see you there. But this is the night that we moved in. This is the day that we got keys to the house that's just a block away from here. And as you can see, it's fairly empty. And I remember that night really, really well because that was the night where we started kind of moving a few things in. It was cold that night. I remember that because we had to open all the doors and windows at one point because we lit our dinner on fire by accident and set the fire alarm off. I remember that it was a Tuesday night because people from TNL were parking on our street and then walking over to Acoma. I remember that was the night that Lucy strung together a few consecutive steps for the first time right there in that living room. I remember that was the night that we ate frozen pizza and drank champagne because we're a classy bunch, and celebrated the fact that God was affirming in so many ways that we were planting a church in and for the city of Inglewood at just the right time. But as you can see, it was pretty empty. Not in that picture, but in the one prior to it, it was pretty empty. There wasn't a lot there. But in this next picture, that's the same vantage point, and that's just a month later. 1 month later, we had our Christmas Eve open house, which is what we do on the 23rd of December every single year. And 1 month later, that place was full of people. 75 or 80 people came through our house that night over the course of 3 hours. There was Christmas decorations and Christmas cards and tables and food, and we packed every square inch of that living room with human beings and tables. And it was really amazing to me how quickly we went from nothing to a lot. Because when we have open space, right, and this is just how we are as human beings, when we have open space, we fill it up. That's what we do. We don't like the idea of open space. Open space kind of makes us feel uncomfortable, and we don't even do it on purpose, right? Like if I go down to my basement right now and I look around, I'm always shocked by the fact that my possessions seem to like breed and create new species. I'm like, there's like things down there I've never seen before, and I'm like, how did this get down here? I don't get it. And that's happened to you every time you've moved. Think about like you move out of a one-bedroom apartment, and you have to get like 3 moving trucks. You're like, how did I fit this much stuff in here, right? We fill space. We have this subconscious way of filling up empty space pretty much all the time whenever we get the opportunity. And you see it around town too. It's not just happening in our homes. It happens around our neighborhoods. So I have a couple different routes that I run in our parish, and I've designed them so that I can keep track of development around here, just something that I find interesting. And so what's happening is a developer comes in and they go, there's a tiny 100-year-old house on that lot, and we could put 2 brand new houses on that lot, and we could make a lot of money. And so they bulldoze that tiny 100-year-old house, and they build a duplex. And this is happening all over the place. You can see it happening in this parish, and probably wherever you live or work, you'll see this happening. And they fill up every square inch of that lot. From side to side, corner to corner, they fill it up with a building. And they go, well, that little house that was there had a front yard and a backyard, but that's a waste of space. We could put a building in the front yard and the backyard. And that house that might have been worth $300,000 is gone, and now there's 2 places in its place that are each worth $600,000. So there's a lot of money to be had in this. And there's some problems that come along with that when there's an increase in population density. I mean, not only does crime rate and a few other things become really, really challenging, but there's just the lack of historic connection. That's hard. There's also some really great things that come with an increase in population density, not least of which is the fact that our tax revenue grows. Also, our commerce and our economy typically gets stronger. There's some really good things that come along with that. So it's not always a problem to fill up extra space, but it is certainly a tendency, isn't it? And it's something we'll see on a national level as well. Bears Ears National Monument, for instance, in Utah, millions of acres that was protected as a national monument under the Obama administration. The Trump administration has recently cut that by 85%. About 1 million acres have been lopped off of that. It's right next to where Julie and I started dating, where I popped the question and asked her if she'd go steady with me. I think I said something a lot stupider than that, actually. I have no idea what I said, but you said yes, which was amazing. But that whole area is a really special place for us. It's something, I used to try and go there once a year. I love that area of Utah. And now a million acres that used to be protected by the federal government is now open from the state government to develop as much as they want. Condos, oil rigs, it could really go wild Open space. Well, let's fill it with something, right? Like we love filling open space, and we do the same things in our personal lives too. If we have open space in our calendar, we fill it up. If we have open space in our, even in like kind of in our mind or in our heart or our soul, like we find a way to pack it to the gills to make sure that we're using our time and our resources as efficiently as possible. We love to fill space. We're entering into the season of Lent. This is the first Sunday of Lent. Last Wednesday was our Ash Wednesday service. And Lent is a season in which we create space. Rather than always trying to fill the space up, we're going to create space this year. That is what we're going to do over the course of the 40-day season of Lent. We're going to create space for God to speak and act. And I'm wondering, if you think about this for a minute, when was the last time God spoke to you? And some of you might be thinking, like, I'm not so sure there's a God there to speak. And even if there is, I'm not sure that he speaks to people, so I'm not really sure what you're talking about. But I wonder if the reason why you haven't heard something from him, whether it's an audible voice or whatever is left to be determined, but I wonder if the reason why you haven't heard from him in a while is because you simply haven't created the space for him to speak and act. Like we've just been so full and busy and moving so quickly that we haven't just stopped to listen. And that is what Lent is about, to create longing and listening in our lives so that we can hear from God. That is our hope for you in the season of Lent. And there's a story that really is behind this entire season. There's a story in the Bible that makes this whole season make sense. It's where all the traditions of the season came from. There's really this one story. And so Caroline's going to come up and read this story from Luke chapter 4.
Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, left the Jordan and was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, where for 40 days he was tempted by the devil. He ate nothing during those days, and at the end of them he was hungry. The devil said to him, "If you are the Son of God, tell this stone to become bread." Jesus answered, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone." The devil led him up to a high place and showed him in an instant all the kingdoms of the world. And he said to him, "I will give you all their authority and splendor. It has been given to me, and I can give it to anyone I want to. If you worship me, it will be all yours." Jesus answered, "It is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." The devil led him to Jerusalem and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. "If you are the Son of God," he said, "throw yourself down from here. For it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, to guard you carefully. They will lift you up in their hands, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." Jesus answered, "It is said, do not put the Lord your God to the test." When the devil had finished all this tempting, he left him until an opportune time. This is the word of the Lord.
So Jesus goes out into the wilderness and he fasts for 40 days. And Luke writes like the greatest understatement in all of literature when he says, and Jesus was hungry. In reality, Jesus was probably barely alive. If you can imagine what it would take to not eat for 40 days, not to mention the exposure that he was experiencing in the desert. This is a very purposefully painful experience that he subjected himself to. And right at his most vulnerable moment, the devil appears and tempts him with 3 particular temptations, each of which we'll talk about in more detail in just a moment. But it's interesting to see the stories that surround this one story. Right prior to this, Jesus was baptized in the Jordan River by John the Baptist. And most people think of that as the beginning of his ministry proper. This is when he began his miracles and his teaching. But before he goes to do all of that, right after his baptism, he goes out to fast for 40 days. And then right after that 40-day period is when he begins to choose his disciples and create a following. And he starts to teach and preach, and he starts to do miracles and amazing things for about 3 years before he goes to the cross, and then he goes to the tomb, and then he rises again and ascends to heaven, all of which we'll celebrate at the end of this season and into the season of Eastertide. But during the season of Lent, what we're doing is stepping into the story of Jesus in the desert. For 40 days, Jesus goes to the desert, he doesn't eat, and he is tempted by the devil. You remember at the beginning of the story that Caroline just read, it said that he was led into the desert by the Spirit of God to be tempted. This was all very purposeful. It had a point. It wasn't just by accident. He didn't just stumble upon it. It was because it was right. It was because it was the best way for him to start his ministry. And when you dig a little bit deeper into his responses to the devil during these temptations, you'll see that they all come from about the same place. Everything that Jesus says in response to Satan comes from the book of Deuteronomy. And we said a few weeks ago, the book of Deuteronomy is a retelling of the law to a new generation. So it's the last book in the Torah, and it's a retelling of the law. It's like we're going to say it all over again. It's very similar to Leviticus, for instance, but we're going to say it again. We're going to say it in a different way. But it's not just a retelling of the law that he's referencing. He's referencing the 40 years that the people of God spent in the desert. Every part that he references in Deuteronomy specifically relate to that one story. So if you don't know this, the Israelites, the people of God, were enslaved by Egypt for a long, long time. Generations passed, and they were enslaved. And they experienced all the injustices and oppression of slavery during that time. God frees them, but when he frees them, they don't just become like rich and happy. They have to go into the wilderness for 40 years without really knowing where their next meal is going to come from. And they wander for 40 years before they're delivered to the promised land. And 40 is really important. It's important in the story about Jesus. It's important in the story about the Israelite people. I was reading a rabbi this past week who said that the reason why 40 was chosen as a significant number in the Bible is because it takes about 40 weeks for a baby to grow in its mother's womb and then be born. It's 40 years, 40 weeks, 40 days is the amount of time that it takes for something to be created, to come to fruition, to be ready, to be delivered. And that is why 40 years and 40 days are important. That is why 40 weeks in the gestation of a child is really important, that they come to full term during that time. And so we see Jesus mimicking this story. And in doing so, he's creating a replica, a model, a signpost, a remembrance of this bigger story. In going out in the wilderness, he's not just doing something in isolation. He's pointing to this bigger story, this time in which his people were out in the wilderness for 40 years. And there's a few components, there's 3 components, in fact, that we see in both Jesus' story and the story of the Israelite people. And I think they inform the way that you and I practice Lent. You may be totally new to Lent. This may be your first time even hearing the word Lent. You may have thought up until just now that I was talking about the stuff that you find in your pocket. Lent is something that the church has practiced for a really long time. But the reason why we practice it is because we're modeling what Jesus was doing, and Jesus was modeling what his people had done. So we enter into this long line of modeling. That is really what this season is about. And there are 3 things. There are 3 elements that we see both in the story of Jesus and the story of the Israelite people. There are 3 things that make up the infrastructure of Lent. The first is space, physical space that is open enough to make you feel vulnerable. Open enough to make you feel uncomfortable, make you feel a little strange, like something could come out of nowhere maybe and hurt you at some point, right? Now, I'm not saying that literally. I mean, I guess you could do that in Lent, but the point is you're thinking through, I'm in a space, I'm in a place where something could happen. Something unexpected might take place. A space open enough to make you feel vulnerable. The second component of Lent is time. In this case, 40 days or 40 years. For us, it's going to be 40 days, and it's long enough period of time to make you feel uncomfortable. Let's say you were to start something today, like a workout regimen or something like that, and you did it for 2 or 3 days. You would feel a little sore, and those 2 or 3 days would pass, and you would have probably gained very little in those 2 or 3 days. But if you do them for long enough to really experience the discomfort of repetition and progression, you would actually grow and change, and you'd be strengthened. So 40 days is kind of a long time. I don't know if you've ever practiced Lent before, but maybe you've given something up in the past. You've fasted from something, and that's hard to do for 40 days. That's a long time to give something up. It doesn't seem long on the front end, and then you do it, and it is long enough to make you feel uncomfortable. The third component, provision. In this case, food for both the Israelite people and for Jesus. The Israelites wandered around not knowing where their meal was going to come from. God provided them in the form of manna and quail. And Jesus responds to Satan and says, God will provide for me. I don't need you to give me anything. God is the one who will provide. But in these provisions, whatever provision we're talking about during the season of Lent, it has to be scarce enough to make you feel dependent. It has to be scarce enough to make you feel dependent. So if you're like, I'm going to fast for 1 day during 40 days, and that doesn't really contribute to you feeling dependent on God for his provision, then maybe it's something you need to do more frequently during the season of Lent or for a longer period of time or something like that. It has to be scarce enough to make you feel dependent. These are the three things that make up Lent. These are the three things that make up Jesus' time and the Israelites' time. Space that is open enough to make you feel vulnerable, time that is long enough to make you feel uncomfortable, and provision that is scarce enough to make you feel dependent. That is what Lent is about. And we do this here in our church by taking up and giving up. We do it by giving up and taking up and giving up. We give up something to make us aware of the fact that these things distract us from our dependency on God. And we take up practices to create space to listen for God to speak and act. The Henry Nouwen quote on the front of your series card says that if we create space for God to speak and act, we will be surprised. We will experience surprise. Can you imagine what you might experience if for 40 days you create space for God to speak and act? So we give up and we take up. We give up things that make us feel dependent. We make sure that that thing is scarce enough to make us think about God providing. Every year for the past few years, I've given up social media during the season of Lent. And it's because by this time of the year, I have started to turn to that so robotically to feel connection, to feel affirmation, to feel important, to feel whatever. I keep going to Instagram or Facebook or Twitter to experience those things. And I have to cut it out for 40 days to remember that God is the source of that connection for me. That is the source that I must turn towards in order to be fulfilled, not some sort of social media platform. So I delete the app from my phone, and another app ends up in its place. And inevitably, for the first few days, I robotically click whatever app goes into that place. And I'm surprised by well, that's not what I intended. I wanted to see Instagram. And then I went, oh, yeah, right. That's not really what I should be doing right now. It reminds me that I go to that for medication, to maybe numb when I'm in pain or I'm frustrated or I'm afraid. We go to these things instead of going to something that can actually be fulfillment for us. And then we also take up. And so one of the things that I take up last year and this year as well is I take that prayer card that we've printed for you that's available at the exits, and I read through that prayer 3 times a day for 40 days. It's a really simple practice. But after I prayed through that, I give just a couple minutes to listen and to long and to think about what God might say and do. It's really simple to give something up and to take something up. But the things that I'm giving up and taking up, I really feel them. And so you can practice Lent however you want. But if you want to practice Lent in the way that models the way Jesus did it, or the way that models Jesus' time in the desert, you will create space that is open enough to make you feel vulnerable for a length of time that is long enough to make you feel uncomfortable, and the provisions will be scarce enough for you to feel dependent. There's a lot of ways that you can do this and a lot of practices you can take up. I encourage you, if you're not on our weekly email, make sure that you are, because we're going to be sending out different ideas. In the coming weeks, we'll send out a link to a 40-day text message service that will text you Scripture that will help you meditate on Scripture every single day for 40 days. We're going to send you a link for a podcast that allows you to go through sort of a Lectio Divina, like while you're driving in the car, like thinking about Scripture and reflecting on what God might have said. We're going to send you a lot of resources. And so keep your eye out on that email if you're trying to figure out what will Lent look like for you this year. But if I can encourage you to think of one thing, it would be to think about the infrastructure of Lent and the importance of those 3 components. I would be remiss not to remind you about the single and most important thing about Lent, and that is the liability of Lent. There is a liability that comes along with opening yourself up to listening to God. And that liability is temptation. Temptation and doubt is inevitable in the season of Lent. You will experience it. Satan comes to Jesus and he says 3 things to him. And behind each thing that Satan says to Jesus is a question. He's asking, can God really provide for you? Is God really worthy of your worship? And will God really protect you from harm? It's reminiscent of the question that Satan asks Adam and Eve in the garden. Adam and Eve, prior to sin becoming a part of the fabric of reality, have dominion and responsibility over a specific place. It's theirs to take responsibility over. And Satan comes to them and says, are you sure? Like, did God really say that you can't eat from that tree? Did he really say that? And almost in the same tone, he tests Jesus. But the difference between Jesus and Adam and Eve is that Jesus resists the temptation. You will experience temptation. temptation towards gluttony or lust or coveting or envy. You'll experience temptations like this. You're not wrong for being tempted. The question is, how will you respond to that temptation? Will you respond with a line in the sand saying, no, I won't go there because I'm giving myself space to hear from God? Or will you respond by giving in? That is the question. And so when you hear questions rattling around in the back of your mind, like, can God really provide for you? Is God really worthy of worship? Will God really protect you from harm? When you hear questions like that, be ready to respond to those with resistance. Lent is a time for creating space for God to move and speak. Lent is a time for longing and listening. Lent is a time for repentance and resistance. Repenting for the things that we know make our hearts dark and resisting the temptation to continue in that pathway. Those are the things that make up Lent. There's a lot more that we could say about Lent. There's a lot more that we could say about that passage. And in the coming weeks, you're going to hear more about practices and rhythms, and I'm excited for that. We're going to spend time in the book of John throughout the season of Lent, and we're going to look at stories about Jesus that point to an older, bigger story, just like this one. And the older, bigger story are the rhythms and practices that God put in place for his people so that they could create space to hear from him and to see him act, to long and to listen for him. That's what the rhythms of the Israelite people were about. That's what their feasts and festivals were for. And then Jesus goes and replicates those to remind us of them, and we're going to spend Lent remembering those stories. That's what we're going to do for the next 40 days, for the next 6 Sundays, leading up to Good Friday and Easter Sunday. Normally at this time in our service, after the sermon, I pray, and then we experience the Eucharist together. And usually the Eucharist elements are over there on that table. And you'll notice that other than the candles that are there, the table is empty. And it will remain empty for the season of Lent. Phil Owen, the pastor of TNL, and I agreed that we wanted our churches to feel a bit of longing, a bit of emptiness during the season, corporately, together. I mean, you're going to feel that kind of individually as you practice these things. But in community, we wanted to feel a sense of longing, like something was kind of missing. And my hope is that we've been practicing the Eucharist regularly long enough that it feels weird to you for 6 weeks. I want it to. Because I want for the end of this season, when we do take the Eucharist again, that you would feel overjoyed with the celebration. That like something that you was missing has now been fulfilled. That is my hope for you.